You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeology Podcast, Episode 1. I'm Chris Webster.
And I'm April Camp Whitaker. On today's show, we'll be talking about how people get into archaeology.
Let's dig a little deeper. Welcome to episode 1 of this new show for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We're going to start off by talking about why and how we got started in our archaeology careers.
So I work at a university as a graduate student, and one of the things that's been happening now is that a lot of the undergrads are starting to think about what they want to do next. They're finishing up their seniors. So what is your next step if you're an anthropology major? And a lot of them have been coming and talking to the graduate students about things like applying to graduate school. And this really got me thinking about why people decide to become archaeologists and what's that first incentive that moves you from just being someone who maybe takes an anthropology class to actually pursuing a career in this field, since we all know it can be a little bit challenging. And the diversity of reasons behind this. And so this is kind of what we wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, and I think we can get the sort of elephant in the room out of the way right away, because people of a certain age probably got into archaeology because of Indiana Jones. Let's just admit that, because that's my demographic. The first movie came out when I was like 10, and it was a huge influence on me. So I don't know. I always liked it, but we'll get into that later. So, but also I also want to bring up something, because you mentioned, you go to school and people trying to figure out what they're going to do. They're in their senior year. My senior year of college, we had a class called Senior Seminar in the last semester. It was actually a really good class to help prepare you for the big outside world, But two of the books that they had us read, one was called something like Managing Your Quarter Life Crisis or something like that. I was already like 30 when I was in there, and this was designed for like 25-year-olds. And I'm thinking, yeah, all right, I've been in the Navy. I've kind of been around the world a little bit. You guys don't even know what a quarter life crisis is. So, calm down. But anyway, and then there was a book about careers in anthropology, I think it was called. None of which were archaeology, right? This whole entire book about everything you can do with an anthropology degree, none of it was archaeology, because they were kind of coming to the terms in this book that, hey, as an anthropologist, you're probably not going to find a job doing actual anthropology, but your skills will allow you to do customer service or, all these other things that you now have this worldly view of humanity, and you can do these things. So yeah, that's how they kind of kicked us off in my undergrad. I don't know how the University of Arizona does it, how they're encouraging people, but you guys actually have grad school programs, and they can see graduate students and what the academic side of things are. So I don't know, that probably has something to do with it.
Yeah, I think it really does, because a lot more of our undergrads are talking about going on to grad school. And I think it's because what they see are graduate students who got their undergrads in anthropology or archaeology and then generally went straight on into a graduate program, or for a few people kind of left and did other things like myself. But yeah, there's definitely kind of this idea that, oh yeah, you have to have a master's or a PhD to do anything, which I think is a really interesting thought process.
Yeah, and that goes for, contract archaeology or commercial archaeology and academic. Obviously, people think academic archaeology, I think they automatically think PhD, even though that's not necessarily the case, depending on if you're going to teach, depending on where you go, you don't necessarily need a PhD. It's kind of the commonly accepted thing. And I think for funding, it really helps to have a PhD for federal funding and things like that. But, for contract archaeology, depending on the state that you're working in, you might not even need a graduate degree. I know plenty of people here in Nevada, because of the BLM's permitting requirements, that are principal investigators, and they don't have graduate degrees. It used to be a requirement. Now you can substitute that with experience, project management experience. And I feel like these people are stuck in the companies they work in. If they want to stay at that level, if they move to another company, they'll probably be right back down to the bottom because they don't have a graduate degree. It's it's not, well, I guess they're not stuck, but it would be difficult because they've come from the ground up in this one company, and then to move to another one without that educational background would be a little bit of a tough sell. Not impossible, but a little bit of a tough sell. So, it's just it just depends on what you want to do. There's other places in the country too where a master's degree is required to start a company. Nevada's like that. They probably won't give you what they call a cultural resource use permit for your company, which you need to do work on federal lands here. They probably won't give you that unless you have a graduate degree. They might, but they probably won't. I guess it just depends on who you are and whether or not they know you and things like that. But it definitely helps, but it's not a necessary requirement.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot too. And I think in a range of career fields, like I worked in museums for a while, and there's definitely a moment where you can stay in the museum for a long time with just a bachelor's degree, but eventually you kind of reach a plateau where your experience can only get you so far in terms of pay raises and position changes. And then eventually you do kind of run out of options, which I think is interesting because I've also seen people walk out with masters or PhDs who have no idea what they're going or how to actually implement those because they've never used them in a real world setting. It's always been in a classroom setting. And so it's a really interesting balance between you can have all the education you want, but if you've never used that education, how useful is it really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Sometimes it's just a check in the box. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's just like, hey, I need to do this. That's kind of how mine was. I was hitting a ceiling because I was working in the Southeast, and I needed to get a graduate degree if I wanted to move up into project management and stuff like that. And because that's how it worked over there. And I mean, I'd worked for a number of people that just came, they went high school, undergrad, master's degree, and then my boss, right? They didn't know anything really about field archaeology or anything like that. I'm sure they were great people, but they weren't really leaders in contract archaeology, so to speak. And I was like, wow, I could do such a better job. So I'm going to figure out how to go to grad school. But I knew that grad school was literally a check in the box. I mean, nobody cared what you did. Nobody cared where you went, and nobody cared how long it took you. You just needed to have the piece of paper, right? So eventually I was contacted by a former professor of mine from my undergrad who had heard about this program and knew what I was doing. And she told me about it. And it was a new program from the University of Georgia at Athens, and it was a 1-year master's degree in archaeological resource management. So it's exactly what I was doing. Taught you all about environmental law, project management, but also dug into theory a little bit and all that other stuff. And you did a thesis and, just like a normal program, except it was accelerated. Instead of taking partial class loads and teaching, you didn't do any teaching, and you took 15 to 18 credits a semester for 3 semesters, fall, spring, and summer. And then you graduated. So of the 5 people in my class, only 2 of us graduated on time. So it was a tough program. If you missed a step at all, you were probably into a 4th semester. But that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in and then right back out because it was hurting my career to not be back in the field because, like I said, I knew that graduate degree was just a check in the box, and I wasn't going to move on in the academic sphere. I just needed to get back in the workforce. So, and it worked out eventually. But that's what we've talked about on the CRM Archaeology podcast. If you're interested in contract archaeology, about education quite extensively. So, go over to that podcast and type in the search education or degree or master's degree or bachelor's degree, something in the search terms, and you'll find podcasts on us having extensive conversations about that. Plus, we've talked to a lot of graduate programs discussing how their class structure works, and it's really about just finding what works for you. So I know we're going to get into our backgrounds and why we got into archaeology and more importantly, I think why we stay in archaeology, because a lot of people get into it, but how many people stay in it? I'm not sure about those statistics. Because once you get into school, or once you do a field school, or once you do some field work or something like that, you might find it's just not for you. I've known a handful of people. A good friend of mine that April had just met a couple weeks ago. She's done the same thing. She's entered into a couple different programs and then decided, getting into it, that it just wasn't for her, and I have to respect that decision. But rather than going all the way through it and finishing something you're just not sure about, she's just like, nope, you know what, I've given this a shot, and I'm going to back out of this because it's a waste of my time. So, and I respect that. You have to imagine that, but or you have to do that if it fits for you. So I feel like we're getting a wider audience on this podcast. That being said, a lot of our initial followers or listeners to this show are probably people who have heard me speak before. So I'll do my background last and what I did to get into archaeology and to stay in archaeology. So April, why don't we talk about yours first? What were your greatest influences for getting into archaeology?
Sure. Well, I have a slightly different background in that I am kind of genetically engineered to be an archaeologist, in that both of my parents are archaeologists and teach archaeology. So, so I actually grew up going to archaeological digs, and let me
Nice.
tell you, it's really boring. When you're like 6 years old, standing somewhere in the desert, watching a bunch of adults talk about rocks and being hot and hungry, makes you kind of apathetic towards archaeology. I'm going to be honest. My dad likes rocks, so there was a lot of looking at rocks, and it just never appealed to me. And so I actually swore I would never be an archaeologist. And I went into my undergrad, and I was going to be an ecologist and do environmental activism and all sorts of wonderful things. And then I had to take a class that was a intro to the intro bio class that they used to also weed out medical students. And it was horrible. It was the worst class I've ever taken. And I've never studied so hard in my life to not truly understand something, because it was just memorization. And there wasn't a story behind it. And I think part of why I like archaeology and anthropology is we're telling a story. And I think in stories, like I think a lot of us do. And I realized that this was not the career field for me. So then I did what all undergrads do, and I tried like 6 different majors and finally take an anthropology class because I had to fill a requirement. And I was like, okay, this makes sense. I think like this. I could do anthropology. And then I went home for the summer. And then I started a new school. I transferred schools, and my new college had a studio art requirement.
Wow.
And yeah, we had to take one studio art class. It's really unusual, but it's great. It's actually a really fun requirement. And so I took ceramics, studio ceramics. And then I went home for the summer and I was unemployed. And my parents were like, great, we'll pay you $5 an hour to analyze all of our shirts.
Wow.
And I was like, all right, sure, why not? $5 an hour, sure. And I realized I loved it. I absolutely loved doing analysis and looking at the shards and thinking about this in connection with my own studio experiences and thinking about how I make pottery and then connecting that back to these artifacts. And I was like, oh, archaeology can be kind of interesting. Why have I always thought it was really boring? And it got me really interested in thinking about how do we teach people about archaeology? How do we allow them to experience archaeology in ways that are both informative and interesting? And so I decided, all right, we'll pursue this. I'll change my major. I'll become an anthropologist. And then when I left school, I kind of was in that void that a lot of anthropology majors fall into, where I had no clue what to do next. My undergrad didn't have graduate students. And so there wasn't this sense that you finish school and you go on to graduate school. And so I kind of floated around and I did a bunch of random jobs and I worked some contract archaeology and I ended up at a museum. And so I spent, I think, about 1.5 years working at the Field Museum, and I got working with exhibits in part, and I got really interested in this. And I was like, this is interesting. Museums are a great way of talking to the public. And so then I got a master's in museum studies and archaeology, thinking about, okay, if we can use museums to really tell detailed stories, because I also grew up going to museums and being half fascinated and half really bored. And starting to think about how do we really make museums engaging places for archaeology, which I think archaeology is really successful at. And then I finished and I went and got a job, and I sort of have bounced back and forth a lot between doing archaeology in an academic setting and then using it in more real world museum and contract settings. And always trying to figure out how to stay interested, how to keep people interested, and how to keep myself interested. So that's kind of my background and kind of my cardinal sin of being the child of two archaeologists. So we say that I'm in the family business.
Nice, nice. I'm sure they're happy about that. Did they want you to become an archaeologist or kind of find your own path?
They were kind of hoping I'd pick a career with guaranteed income. Uh, but they
Right.
also understand. And it's kind of fun because then we have family dinner conversations where we argue about the best methods for developing a typology or it's a different family dynamic.
Hey, I've got one of your dad's books on my shelf here. That's 6 cents a month has got to be guaranteed income, right? Yeah, every
Oh
time
yeah.
somebody buys it.
Oh yeah. That put me through college right there.
I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did. That's the dirty little secret of publishing right there is that you're not J.K. Rowling. So, you know, you're not going to make a lot of money on putting books out, even if you're even if your book is relatively famous and a lot of schools assign it. It's just it's really hard to do. Anyway, yeah. So all right. So that's cool, and we'll get into some more. I want to kind of dig into that a little bit. We'll do that after the end of the segment, but I'll give my brief background because, like I said, it's probably all over the other podcasts if you've heard anything about these things. But anyway, like I said, I grew up in the Indiana Jones era, and I think I always had, because my family didn't have a lot of money, we didn't travel much, but we did have like an acre of property. Well, we had technically an acre or so, with this just a small house surrounded by trees and woods and stuff, and some other houses and things. But there was nobody behind us. There was no house. There is now. There was no housing development behind us then, though. So we explored those woods, and we're always digging things and exploring things and doing stuff. So I think just that environment and being outside was something that really appealed to me, and even though I didn't really know why. But then something else that really appealed to me was airplanes and flying. So when I got out of high school, I didn't think I had. I didn't think I was college bound because I didn't know anything about federal student loans. I had really crappy guidance counselors that didn't give me any guidance whatsoever. So I took my default because I didn't think college was possible and went into the Navy. And so I, got to travel the world a little bit with them and work with planes and work on the flight deck, served on the Enterprise, and that was all really cool. So, but when I got out of the Navy, I went to commercial flight training school in Oklahoma, and then transferred from that school after I got my pilot's license to the University of North Dakota to finish that out. Well, the first school I went to in Oklahoma was basically a tech school for pilots. They had your basic general education courses that were that were all, everybody takes the same classes, and you don't have any choices on your electives. It's like American history, 1865 to present. I was like, all right, this is boring. But when you come out of it, you have a degree in aviation administration or something, and you're on your way to becoming a Southwest Airlines pilot. But I didn't really want that. I wanted a better school. I wanted more diversification. So I transferred to the University of North Dakota, which oddly enough is the #1 liberal arts flight school in the nation. Plus they have all the other stuff a college has. So, which was electives. And I filled all my electives up with archaeology and anthropology classes. I eventually ended up realizing that I didn't want to be a commercial bus driver. I still like to fly, but I just didn't want to be a bus driver for the rest of my life. And that's what commercial airline pilot job was. Sure, it pays well, but I mean, where's the satisfaction at the end of the day? You know what I mean? So I ended up dropping that as a major and didn't pick up a new major for a year while I took a whole bunch of math classes because I didn't know what else to do because I liked math. I took a whole bunch of photography classes too because, why not? And then finally came to my last year there, or what should have been my last year. And I was like, I've just got to do something. And what do I have the most credits in? And it turned out it was anthropology. And I still didn't think I could make a career out of archaeology. I'm still not sure. But anyway, I just said, okay, I can do this. I've got to take 15 credits per semester to finish these upper level classes that I couldn't take without declaring it as a major. So I declared it over the summer, finished up with my anthropology degree from the University of North Dakota in May of 2005 or whatever it was. And promptly went to work for my brother's father-in-law's home remodeling company in Seattle for the summer because that's what you do. And then it turns out I went to Africa with an Earthwatch expedition, which look up Earthwatch. It's a pretty great thing. But I wanted to go there it was kind of my field school. We worked in Olduvai Gorge, dug 2 test units, 2 big trenches in Olduvai Gorge, stayed in the same camp that the Leakeys built. And in fact, the son of the cook that the Leakeys had was our cook. And so that was pretty cool. And that really reignited my passion for archaeology. And when I got back from that, I'd heard about shovel bums and ended up getting a job in CRM, and the rest is history. So let's come back to that after a quick break, and we'll dig into this a little deeper and talk about some other stuff related to careers in archaeology. Professional Certifications for Scientists, or PCS, aims to provide practical educational videos, field guides, knowledge tests, professional certifications, and employment connections to professional scientists everywhere. Check out the resources page for useful links, a directory of CRM archaeology firms in the U.S., and a link list to state site forms. Find PCS resources at www.pcscourses.com/resources. PCS, a place for good scientists to become great science professionals.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
All right, we're back. So I was talking about my my story about archaeology. I'll tidy that up a little more, just to say. Well, first off, I love having you on this podcast, April, because I like having the academic side. We actually don't have any shows on the Archaeology Podcast Network where somebody is in the academic side of things, and has that as kind of a career track. It's mostly CRM people or variations on that. So I really like that because I like that perspective, because my kind of dirty little CRM secret is I've kind of always wanted to be in that sort of academic landscape, because I like to teach. I like to, a lot of the things I do, from the podcast network to my blog to this other thing we're doing, professional certifications for scientists. I like educating and teaching and doing that kind of thing. And I think it'd be something I'd want to do, but probably later in my career. I like right now being on sort of the front lines of archaeology, because I've heard statistics that say anywhere from 80 to 90% of archaeology in this country is done by CRM archaeologists, which, if you look at it, totally makes sense, because we're constantly doing stuff. Now, it's not the sexy, exciting archaeology that people see on TV. It's the, oh, look, 2 tin cans, let's record that. But it's archaeology nonetheless. And I think that's important. I think it's really important to tell those stories in little minute pieces at a time, because a lot of people get frustrated in this field in recording these little can scatters and a little 2-flake lithic scatter or something like that. But what they don't realize is they're just giving one sentence of this story that's in a huge book that eventually somebody, even them if they want to, can take all this information we've gathered from the big database and say, oh, this is what all that means, or this is what all that doesn't mean, or something like that. And we only get 2 words out of that entire paragraph when we record a 2-flake lithic scatter. So I like that. I like that we're putting that story together as we go along. But that's basically my deal. I own a CRM firm now, and I'm a partner in another one, a sort of a joint venture firm, and I think one of the things we'll have to talk about later on is where you can go with an archaeology degree or anthropology degree, because it's not just digging and it's not just teaching. It's so many different things you can do that are still related to the field. And diversification, which I think we mentioned on the last show, is huge. If you're not doing that, then you're probably not going to be successful unless you get some, golden ticket somewhere. So, April, you talked to a few of your friends and colleagues there. What did they have to say?
Yeah, so I did a really informal polling where, as I was running into people yesterday in the course of my daily life, I was like, I'll just ask them. And I realized it's one of those questions that you kind of know, but you've never actually asked a lot of people. It's very rare that you actually just say, so how did you get into this career? And it was interesting. Some of their responses kind of tied in with yours, Chris, where, they took a class and they were like, this is interesting. This makes sense to me. And I think that's kind of a really common universal. Either you take a class and the professor is amazing. And they're such a fascinating professor, and the things they teach you they just capture your attention. Or you take an anthro class and you realize that you already kind of think about the world in this way. I think one of my friends was sort of saying anthropology teaches us to look at the world in a very different way than a lot of people do, where you look out and you realize that everybody has a reason for doing things the way they do, and those reasons aren't universal, that they're really culturally determined. And so it as you walk through your daily life, you start to see the world through the lens of an anthropologist, and I think there's something kind of inherently appealing about that. We think about the world differently, and so you get sucked into that. And so it's both challenging, but if you already think in stories and you kind of question how things operate and why they operate that way, then you're already kind of doing anthropology or archaeology, since archaeology is sort of adding the material component in. And so that was one of the really common ones I got, is just taking a class. That first undergrad class you had to take as a requirement. Or one of my other friends was also saying he ended up in kind of a position you were in where he'd taken a bunch of different things. He didn't know what his major was going to be. He took all these different classes, and eventually he just sat down. He had basically a year left, and he was like, I have to finish in a year or a year and a half. And I'm just going to look through the course catalog and think about what can I imagine myself doing every day and being happy and being interested in? And then I'm going to take those classes and see if I could do this. And he ended up taking an anthro class and going, yep, I could do this. And ended up finishing the major, and now is in a PhD program. And, it was just sort of a fluke of I could finish this major in the allotted time, and I could see myself being interested and happy in this career, which I think is something that's really important, is realizing that, you can be happy. This is something that you'll honestly enjoy doing. And then, of course, there were a couple people who had the lifelong, I've always known I would be an archaeologist. I built temples and dug them up in my backyard, kind of component to it, which I think a lot of people do on their own anyway, as kids, but not as many people had that sort of I've always known reaction. But, and some of it was I've always known because it was something I was exposed to. I grew up and my parents took me to archaeological sites, and I just thought they were fascinating. Was another one I heard a lot. So it's, you go to museums, you go to archaeological sites, and you become interested in them. And then you try to seek out, how do I get to do this? How do I get to kind of be involved in this? And then for me, I think part of it, and I think this is another reason I hear it a lot from people I know, is travel. There's a sense of adventure and movement in archaeology. You're locked into a field of study, but at the same time, you get to explore the world, or at least even explore the areas you live in. And you can blend a lot of your interests in. So, if your hobby is knitting, well, you know what? You can pull that into archaeology in interesting ways, especially in academia. And, you can end up doing small research projects on how different purlings patterns end up and are, what this means. I have no idea. But, you can pull these interests in. I think that really draws people to archaeology, is that there's this huge breadth of pieces and questions that can be asked.
Yeah.
So those were a lot of the reasons I got from people as I was talking to them. And, some of them kind of mirror some of the reasons that I got into it too. There's lots of pieces of the story like, oh, you take a class, it's great. Or just the sense of freedom and adventure. I mean, even as a contract archaeologist, in a weird way, you're exploring parts of the United States that no one has a reason to go to.
Often there's a reason they're not going there, especially here in Central Nevada. But no, you're right.
Still exploration. And I think that's, if you think about a lot of people become archaeologists, there is this element of liking the outdoors, liking to travel, liking to explore. I know that's why I love survey above anything else, because I'm walking areas and I'm exploring places, and looking and seeing what I'm going to see, and that sense of discovery.
Yeah, I always I always love survey out here in the high desert because there are so many areas, like you said, where the minute you leave the road, the little 2-track road there, chances are when you find something, whether it's an early 20th century can scatter or a prehistoric site or something like that, there's a really good chance that no one else has seen that since those items were deposited because there's so much land out here. And I always really liked that. I always like coming up over a hill, a really hard climb over a hill when you're doing survey, and then just sitting down, waiting for everybody to gather because there's usually, usually people come up these hills at different rates, and we'll take a break at the top and just sitting there and looking out over the landscape, and you can't see anything. There's no planes flying overhead. There's no cars. There's no people. There's no anything. So your worst day on survey, where it's hot, it's you haven't found anything, anything neat, anything cool, you haven't really recorded anything, you're just walking. Your worst day doing survey is a pretty fantastic hike in the high desert, right? And you get paid for that. So now that's some of the reasons we came out west, my wife and I, because we liked that aspect of it because I'll tell you what, your worst day doing survey in the southeast is you also don't find anything, but then you were bit by a snake, eat up by mosquitoes, and your arms and legs were cut up by briars. So that's why I never work in the southeast. No, I'm not going to say that. There's lots of stuff to find, but there's lots of benefits to coming west. But I do want to comment on a couple of things you just said too. Like you said, a lot of people just take an anthropology class because it's an elective, right? They can cover their social sciences elective or something like that by just taking intro to something, whether it's intro to anthropology, or I know my school, I don't even think we had an intro to anthropology, but we had intro to archaeology, intro to bioanthropology, and intro to cultural anthropology. And those 3 classes were required, obviously, if you're going to be a major. But a lot of people took those classes because they were "quote unquote" an easy A. So I think anthropology benefits from being an easy A in the short term, and on the easy classes, because it gets a lot of people in and gets them interested in something they didn't even know they might be interested in. So I think we benefit from that. And also a quick comment on your friend that ended up getting his PhD. That's the other thing I love about this. Like I said early on, is I eventually wouldn't mind teaching at a university someday. And if I have to get a PhD to do that, one of my motivations, I'm 41. I came into this field a little late because I did the Navy and I did some other things and I did all the whole aviation thing. And I didn't even get my BA in anthropology until I think I was 30 or 31 when I graduated. So I was a little later in life, but not nearly as late as 2 of my professors that I had. I don't even know what their backgrounds were before they got their PhDs, but we were in kind of flux in our department at the University of North Dakota at that time frame. And some people were leaving because they were just retiring. And so we had a whole bunch of people retire at once. So we had to bring new people in. Well, 2 of my professors that came in, one of them, she got her PhD in her 50s. In cultural anthropology, and she was a concert pianist before that. So now she teaches anthropology, and she's still there. And then the other one, I think she was in her mid to late 40s when she got her PhD. I'm not sure what her background was before that, but it wasn't in teaching, that's for sure. And now she's still teaching anthropology. She's more of a bio person too. So that's one of the things I love about this job. You don't have to go get your PhD when you're 25. You can do it when you're 50. And that's kind of my plan, although 50 is coming around the corner quicker than I'd like. But maybe 60. Who knows? I don't care. All I know is after a career in doing this, I can probably get into a university. I wouldn't say easily, but relatively easily, depending on the program. If really all I wanted was a PhD, I could probably do that without much difficulty. And then you're in a better frame of mind as an adult, I feel like, with your organizational capabilities to actually do this and do it well, because it's something you've thought of for so long. You're just going to do a good job at it. So, yeah, it's great. It's great to do that. And I've also met field technicians that decided, I met this one guy who was probably in his 60s a few years ago, and he'd been an accountant his whole life. And at some point, he had a bachelor's degree. And at some point, he's just like, you know what? Accounting sucks. I've been doing it for 30 years, and it sucks. And he went back to school, got another undergraduate degree in anthropology, and now he's an archaeological field technician, and he loves it. He's got the best job, though, because a lot of archaeology out here in the West only happens for about 9 months out of the year, because when there's snow on the ground, you can't do pedestrian survey. If you can't see the archaeology on the ground, because we don't dig in the desert, and there's various reasons for that, but we don't dig on pedestrian survey, so if you can't see the ground, you can't work. So generally, development slows down from about end of November to February, March timeframe. Well, he does taxes during that timeframe. So, when January starts to hit, he does taxes, and then he picks back up into field archaeology. And I know a number of people that are ski instructors over the winter up here at like Lake Tahoe or wherever they work in Colorado, something like that. They're just ski instructors for the winter, and then they do archaeology for the rest of the season. So lots of options. I don't know.
Yeah, I ran into someone else too who got into archaeology through an interest in primitive technologies, which I think is another kind of interesting and not uncommon gateway.
Right.
There's lots of interest in things like atlatl hunting with atlatls, or flint napping, and how kind of survivalists get interested in this. Just people who like to work with their hands and are interested in history or prehistory, and then it's another gateway that really draws in a broader audience, and a really different audience. And, at least one person I know started that way and ended up kind of going back and leaving their career doing I think they were a chemist, and did chemical engineering stuff. I pay a lot of attention to this part of it. But, now he's now kind of doing shovel bum work and really enjoying it. And it's almost a retirement.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, and you can meld these things. The co-founder of this of the Archaeology Podcast Network, Tristan Boyle, has a degree in, I don't know if it's technically a degree in archaeochemistry, but that's what he did. He studied chemistry first and then went into archaeology. Now his basic focus after he's graduated is chemistry in archaeology. And there's a lot of stuff that he's over in Scotland, so they have a lot of those bogs and moors and things where you can have different chemical processes and things like that happening. They do a lot of the tooth analysis and stuff like that. So there's a lot of chemistry in archaeology, just to pick one field to meld with that. So there's a lot of, I feel like people that nobody just digs anymore. Nobody just digs and does that stuff. You have to meld these different fields, and if you have another interest, like April just said, if you have another interest, you can probably bring that into an anthropological focus with that interest, and be successful with it. So, I don't know. April, one of the things we have on our notes here is favorite classes. What were some of your favorite classes in your undergraduate?
I actually took a class in the classics department. It was the only archaeology class offered in my school. And it was, on classical archaeology and really focused on Pompeii, which was kind of a childhood obsession of mine. There's a National Geographic special on Pompeii from, I think, the late 80s, early 90s that I recommend to anyone and everyone because it's truly phenomenal. And I think I memorized it as a child. So that would have to, and the teacher was really good. So that would have to be one of my favorites. I had some truly bad anthropology classes too. One where the professor spent the whole time talking about her dissertation research.
Oh yeah,
that's a classic.
Yeah, nice. I have my school, it was mostly focused on anthropology. So a lot of the different aspects of anthropology, and we had archaeology classes, like we had laboratory methods in archaeology. But quite frankly, I wasn't interested in archaeology when I was in school. I was always interested, and this is why I went to Olduvai Gorge after I graduated. I was always interested in paleoanthropology, early human origins type stuff. And actually, in the beginning of my senior year, when I realized that I was going to finish up as an anthropologist, or at least as a degree with one, I looked around and I found out that one of the best schools to go to for a graduate degree in paleoanthropology, because I didn't really know what I was doing, was Arizona State, where April is now. So I applied there and was probably one of the first applications thrown in the trash. No, I'm just kidding. But the quality of people that apply to that program for paleoanthropology is so phenomenally high. I didn't realize that. And one of the things that they tell you can do is to actually talk to the graduate the graduate program administrator, like the office person, and say, hey, where did my application actually fall in line with these other things? Where was I deficient so I can apply next year? That's when I found out that, like 200 people applied and they took 4 or something like that. And also that the 4 that had applied, it was like their second or third year applying to that program. It wasn't, it was like, if you try to apply to that first time out, you better be a superstar or know somebody, because that was the deal. But I didn't know anything about applying to grad school. I just threw in my application. But that was my interest. So my favorite classes were like the bioanthropology classes, and then the like my osteology class. I really liked that. I was terrible at it, but I really liked it. I had to really study hard for that class. But anyway, let's take another break, and we'll come back and wrap this up with some of the fun things you can do as an archaeologist, and probably some of the horrible things too, and maybe some differences. All right.
This is Christopher Sims, host of the Go Dig a Hole podcast. It's a show geared for early career archaeologists where I bring interviews and casual panel discussions about the challenges and opportunities that many archaeologists encounter starting off. So, if you're still in school, thinking about going back, just getting started, or want to take the next step, you'll find what you need to go dig a hole. Tune in every other week on the Archaeology Podcast Network.
All right, we're back for our final segment. We're going to kind of try to wrap this up in the next 19 minutes or so. So one of the things I want to bring up that we have on our show notes here is adventure and travel. People always look at archaeology, especially, probably because of Discovery Channel and National Geographic, and they say, "Oh, I get to go see pyramids," or like April mentioned, "I get to go see Pompeii." Not that this is just kind of a coincidence, but I was actually in Pompeii almost a month ago, exactly. But it's not always the case. It depends on what you're doing. If you're in cultural resource management archaeology, you will, by almost definition, travel a lot. Even if you're permanently employed, salaried at a company, the chances of you having an excavation that's within driving distance of your office daily, where you leave the office and you come back to the office every day, are pretty slim. Over in the southeast and maybe even the northeast, that might be a little more the case because their areas that they work in are a little smaller. But out here in the West, it's rare that you don't have a 4-hour drive minimum just to get to the project area, which means you're staying out there for up to 10 days at a time and then coming back for 4 days. We do 10 on, 4 off a lot. So, and that's the other thing too. Every time I tell somebody I'm an archaeologist, there's like, "Oh, what countries have you been to and where have you done digs?" And I'm like, Nevada, California, Washington. I list off the 17 or 18 states that I've worked in here in the United States, but the only place I've done archaeology in another country is actually Africa, and not that Africa is a country, but Tanzania, and that was for basically a field school, like I'd said. So I'm not the type of archaeologist that does work in other countries, because in CRM you do work in this country, and generally wherever you're at. Now, when I was a field technician, I would just take jobs wherever. One time I was working a job in Miami, Florida. And then got a job in Colorado, and then got a job in Washington State, and then another job back down in Florida. So I was driving, and that was in 1 year. So that was driving all across the country, just doing different things. And you pick and choose, depending on how hungry you are, and you just take the jobs that you want to take, and you apply to the jobs that you want to go to. So now, April, you can speak a little more to the academic side of travel, because it can be quite a bit different, from your own personal experiences and probably from your own academic experiences.
Yeah. So I think in academic archaeology, there's a little bit more of an opportunity to work internationally. I personally work in the continental United States and mainly in the West because I do historic archaeology. But a lot of the people that I work with don't work in the United States. They work in Peru, they work in Mexico, they work in the Near East. Because when you're in the structure of it's a little bit different, where you choose a research area and a set of questions, a time period that you're working in. And then you begin to set up contacts there. And sometimes these are contacts that you developed on your field school. And so, you did a field school in the Near East. And so, people who work there, or you develop them through the graduate program because your faculty advisor works in these regions. And so I've worked in some other countries, mainly through field schools or volunteering to work with other students or faculty. People are looking for people to help on their projects, especially once you have some experience. And so I've done a little bit of that and gotten to work in other countries. But, I think even in academic archaeology, people not sure how much they move around. It's almost like you get things set up when you work internationally, and it's harder to shift from country to country to country, which is one of the benefits of working in the United States, where you can do a project in Colorado and then 6 months later develop another project that's in Florida, because you're not applying for completely different permit structures or governmental institutions in these different states. We're all connected by a single unified country. Even if laws vary from state to state, there's sort of an overarching structure at least.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's interesting. There are lots of opportunities to travel, but I think in academia, you kind of have to make them a little bit. And I know that, like my family, my parents were very good about creating research projects that allowed them to travel and then kind of matching them to different grants or locations that they knew they were interested in going to. And finding funding that allowed us to travel that way. And I know that people do that too. So I think there is a little bit of a difference between travel and adventure locally and travel and adventure internationally. But one of the things that I think is interesting with archaeology is how much, regardless of what you do, there's periods of the year, and like if you're in academic archaeology, you just are home for the summer. I kind of wave goodbye and I'm gone for 2.5 months. And then I show back up and like, oh, hi, how was the whole summer? Oh, everything went well. Good. The cat's still alive. The house is still standing. Great. And, contract archaeology is similar too, where you have an opportunity to travel, and sometimes it's a blessing and sometimes it's a little bit of a curse. I know that when I did contract archaeology, it was kind of tiring sometimes, never being home. But at the same time, it was kind of an adventure to be staying in a different hotel room, every couple of weeks and seeing some new tiny town that you never knew you didn't want to live in. So,
yeah, that's definitely true. The travel in CRM can be pretty extensive if you stick with it. I remember I used to keep track when I was definitely a field tech shovel bum with my wife, and because she was an archaeologist as well. And there was one year, I want to say it was 2008 or so, when we decided, when we started dating, she had a permanent job at a place down in South Carolina, and they had a big field project coming up. So she got me on that project, and then I was hired on salaried as well. And then at some point, we just decided we didn't really like the company we were working for, and we didn't really like working in the Southeast that much, even though she's from Charlotte. She knew that, it's just digging shovel tests and humidity and that environment was just not fun. So we decided to try to move west. Well, the difficult thing about moving west is, and moving to any region really with CRM archaeology, it's very insular, right? Now you're in the Southwest right now. To work in the Southwest, I mean, you've practically got to kill somebody that's working down there right now and then take their job, because they all say Southwest experience required, blah, 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 blah. And if you don't have Southwest experience, how are you supposed to get a job to get that Southwest experience? It's really difficult. Same thing out here in the Great Basin, same thing in California. The bigger the project, the more likely you are to get on because they're desperate for people. So you kind of look for those really big pipeline projects and things like that to gain experience in that area, because like I said, they'll end up hiring just about anybody just to get it done. But so for that 1 year, we left our jobs in January, and we worked in Ohio first. We were on a big pipeline project in Ohio, which was terrible. The high temperature for that project in February some days was -5, and that was terrible. But they were given authorization to just push through the winter because this thing had to get done. So that was terrible. Then we went from there to another big project in New Mexico. And again, difficult to work there, but we found out that they had a limited budget on that project. So most of the people they hired were from the East Coast because the East Coast wages are typically lower. So they didn't have to pay Southwest wages to these people. They could give us $1 or $2 more than we were used to. And we thought we were kings and queens of the high desert there getting all this money. But in reality, it was like $5 less than you should be getting paid in the Southwest. We just didn't know that. But that gave us that experience in New Mexico. And then from there, we went to a job in, where was that? Utah. We went for a job in Utah. And that got us closer to the Great Basin, which was kind of our goal. And then from that Utah job, we got a job in Winnemucca, Nevada. And then we've kind of been here ever since. We ended up renting a house and moving all our stuff over here, but for that one calendar year where we started doing that, I was recording, and I don't have the exact numbers, but it was something like 150 to 180 days in hotels, and something like 100 plus days spent in tents camping throughout the year for that whole project. And we were gone the whole time. We sold both of our cars and purchased or leased a Toyota 4Runner so we could put everything inside of it. And we just lived on the road. We had all our stuff for excavation, survey, camping, hotel, and everything else was in storage. And for a year, we had no place to live that we actually called home. We just lived out of the car. That was true shovel bumming right there. So, and then we did that off and on for a little while after that until we kind of settled into to Reno a little bit. But yeah, I mean, April, your parents have been in academic archaeology for a long time. How often did they? Because I know there are some projects that are just ongoing for decades sometimes, and these professors, they just go back year after year after year, and it's just the gift that keeps on giving. Like the people that dig in Pompeii, they'll never be done, right? So Çatalhöyük, you're constantly hearing stuff out of there because it's such a huge place, right, in Turkey, and they're just constantly digging there and finding new things. So you can make a whole career out of that. What can you remember was like the longest time they may have spent year after year in a certain place, or did they were they specialists on different things, or did they lead excavations in different areas?
So, like a lot of academic archaeologists, when they got their job, there was an expectation that they run a field school and that they pick up the field schools that the person before them had run. And they'd both gone to University of Arizona and been trained in kind of Southwestern archaeology to a certain extent. And the person who ran the field school before them had run a field school in New Mexico. And so they kind of looked around and thought about where they'd be interested in working and where they thought they could come up with good research questions. And maybe there was a void in the literature, and ended up working up in the Flagstaff area. Mm-hmm. And they've run field schools there most of my life. And kind of gone between 3 different sites as their research interests changed, but not really extensively changed regions. They've done some work in other places. They partnered and did some fun projects in Belize. So I got to go and do excavations in Belize for a couple of summers. But, I think there's something about with academic archaeology, especially when you're expected to run a field school, being able to establish it, figure out your dig house, build those connections. When you're dragging students around, it's nice to know what's going to happen to them and with them, because there's so many logistics inherent in just having, 10 to 20 people that you're responsible for feeding and providing a place to sleep. And, you're doing a full-time academic job. So you don't have, in contact archaeology, part of the job is often figuring out, okay, here's our project. How are we going to set up a base? How are we getting equipment there? Renting vehicles and all of that. And I think at least in academic archaeology, it's nice to have that set up. I know the project that I've been on for years, it's been running since 2008, and we go every other year for the field school. But it's nice. We now have something established. We know how the program will run. There aren't kind of huge surprises and hiccups most years. Right. So, it's nice. It's nice being able to kind of lock into one area and then maybe do side research projects or smaller projects in other areas, other countries, and kind of bounce around. But yeah, I think a lot of academic archaeologists kind of lock themselves in a little bit.
Yeah, and as you know, sometimes the data collected over that summer project can take the entire rest of the year, if not multiple years, to just analyze the data. And because your focus is on data collection and artifact collection and things like that. And then you spend the next, the next who knows how long just going through it.
Right. And I mean, some of these big projects that have been ongoing year after year, they have 40 years of research and analysis on publication that still needs to get done. I know that's one of the challenges with archaeology, both fields, but also with academic archaeology, is you do these projects and you need to be publishing them both to maintain your academic career, but also to share that research and get it out there. But it's easy to get a backlog.
Yeah.
Working in museums, you end up with collections where nothing's really ever been published on them. Maybe except the base report, you hope. And it's coming from a professor's collection. It's great. And it's the results of 40 years of research in one area. And yeah, it's kind of challenging for both areas to produce the end write-ups. And I think that gets to how and why you end up doing archaeology and deciding. I think something that's important is figuring out what you like doing about it and making sure you like doing the key aspects, which are sort of the field research, going out and collecting the data, the analysis part, and getting the research done, and then the publication part. And I know at least one of my friends went on a field school and she was dead set on being an archaeologist. And she loved excavation. It was great. And they made them do lab analysis. And she was like, this is the worst thing I've ever done in my life. And now she's a therapist. And,
Right.
But I think that's part of the idea of some of this training is things like field schools, going and volunteering on a dig teaches you what archaeology really is. Aside from kind of the Indiana Jones adventure and travel and finding mummies, and sees kind of the rigor of them all, like the daily activities that you have to slog through, the paperwork that you have to do. Because if you don't like doing that, you probably don't really like being an archaeologist.
Right. Well, and let's be honest. Most of that lab analysis, once you get out and you're a full-fledged professor and you're doing your work, come on, most of that lab analysis is done by students, right? Or their daughters that are home for the summer.
Right. Yeah. For $5 an hour, it was a great gig.
Right. Well, and something you brought up about this trying to get published and doing all these things and having all this data, that's one of the big differences with CRM archaeology, because I've got a project coming up it's a short project, I'll give you that, but the average length of time here that you talk about for publishing is, not publishing, but at least filing the report with whatever agency hired you to do it. I've got 30 days to produce a draft report, and then the agency has 30 days to comment on that. And then once they get it back to me, I have another 30 days to submit the final report. So that's a typical time frame. If it's a longer project, you might get 6 months or something like that. But you're done. You're done with that project. I mean, it could be a pipeline that goes all the way across the entire state, and you've got 6 months to produce a draft report, and then another couple, probably 30 days to address comments on the final report, and you're done. You'll never see it again. It's not like you're going to go back to it years down the road. Now, some people do go back to these projects when they have time. They get a little older, maybe they get into a different position in that company, and other people are doing most of the quote unquote grunt work, doing all the archaeology, and you'll go back to that old data set and maybe produce a paper on it or a conference presentation or something like that. But the reality is most people just don't have time for that. Some of your bigger firms will do that. There's one out in the West here, Far Western Anthropological Research Group. They're pretty good about research. They're stacked with PhDs. One of the few CRM firms in the West that's just stacked with PhDs. So all these people have an academic background, but they're in CRM. So they do so much work that they can afford to take the time and spend the money, because they're not getting anything in return for it, but they can spend the money to actually do some additional research and maybe do some other conference presentations or journal articles or things like that. So. All right. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left in this. Anything you want to say to wrap this up, to get people to go into archaeology and not be a therapist?
Well, I think for me, it comes down to that it's just like any other job. There's huge pros, and then there's also huge cons, and it really just comes down to you deciding whether the pros outweigh the cons. Whether you're willing to travel a lot and be away from home potentially for months at a time, or whether that's just sort of a deal breaker in your mind, or whether, you can sit and write a report for hours, or you just don't really like that. And what you want to do is be outside and exploring. That's kind of how I always approach it when I'm talking to students about whether they want to go on, is sort of say, try different things, go out, try it, get jobs doing CRM, get jobs working in a museum, volunteer if you have to, and just experience what it's really like. Because I think archaeology is a career field where it's built up in ways that aren't necessarily true.
Right. Agreed. I couldn't have said it better myself. So we'll leave it at that. Be sure to keep this podcast on your playlist and subscribe to it wherever you found it. We're on iTunes and Google Play, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find podcasts. We've got a couple episodes coming up that we're in planning right now. We're going to interview some of the people involved with a new documentary that's out this fall called The Anthropologist. And I was actually just contacted by Swedish archaeologist, blogger, and author Martin Rundqvist, and we're going to interview him on a feature episode as well. I've been following his blog for a long time, and he's got some awesome things to say. So keep that in mind, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Archaeology Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. You can provide feedback using the contact button on the right side of the website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeology. Or you can email Chris at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Please like and share the show wherever you saw it so more people can have a chance to listen and learn. Send us show suggestions and follow ArcPodNet on Twitter and Instagram. This show was produced by the Archaeology Podcast Network. Opinions are solely those of the hosts and guests of the show. However, the APN stands by their hosts. This show is edited by Christopher Sims of the Go Dig a Hole podcast. Go check it out. Check out our next episode in 2 weeks, and in the meantime, keep learning, keep discovering new things, and keep listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network. Have an awesome day.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.